Morning, everyone. I know it's noon because the church across the street is ringing the bells, but we're going to give people 1 minute and then we're really going to start because we have so much to cover today. But welcome. Great to see so many names I recognize. Morning. 30 more seconds. Renee, I'm going to have to ask you about this meeting notes thing. I've seen this a couple places now, and I think I might need to start using it. Okay, well, let's get started. I know there'll be more people joining us. But welcome to the final webinar of our four-part series with the national organization, the Housing Narrative Lab, called Putting the Research into Practice. My name is Jenny Jones. I'm the Director of Communications with MHP. And I want to thank everyone who's gone on this journey with us and followed this series, as well as welcoming the newcomers. You've come at the right time. This is the exciting part. Please note that our previous webinars and slide decks can all be found on MHP's website, which is mhponline.org/narrative-change-project, or on our YouTube channel, at MHP-housing. So while this might be the last in the series of these webinars, it is really just the beginning of this work. So stay tuned for next steps, future activities and resources, and looking forward to doing this work with you all. And with that, I'd like to introduce Marisol Bayo from the Housing Narrative Lab, who'll be leading the discussion today. Take it away, Marisol.
Super, Jenny, thank you so much. So everyone, as you might be able to just even see from my face, this is my favorite webinar, because this is when we put all of this hard work into action. We really are going to dig into how do you put these research findings into action in your everyday work. So today we are going to spend some time going through the messages, the findings, giving you examples and content and framing. We're going to do the whole shebang. And so in our last session, we talked about narrative, and we had Jeff and Celinda really kind of give you a rundown of the research itself. So today, as we start to dig into the action part of this, I first would love to know who's on the call. So please put your name, your org, and one thing you actually would like to get out of today's session. And then I will also be sharing my screen with you all when we get started. But again, your name, your organization, how you get it, how you come into this work, and maybe one thing that you would like to get out of today's session. Thank you for, great. And I see that Jenny put in a link there so that you can access all of the documents. Good to see you, Nancy and Scarlett. Wonderful. Feel free to let us know what you would like to get out of today's session. Tangible next steps. Dylan, you are going to get so many tangible next steps. You are going to love it. All right. Let's see. Oh, they're coming fast and furious. Let's, how to incorporate some of the data into comms. Yep, I love that. Some of the strategic pieces. All right. Direct implementation into messaging. We're going to spend some time talking about that today. How to create a housing narrative. We have a shared housing narrative for all of you to engage in as you are starting to kind of move through your work. So I love that. Thank you, Carmen, for adding that. All right. Wendy, how to integrate your conversations into the community and with the community. Yep, we're going to spend a great deal of time talking about unity, community, and inclusion, because Minnesotans really want to see themselves in the work. So how about keep them coming, and I will kick us off and share my screen. Let's see, let's go there. All right. I'm not going to be able to see all of you right now, but hopefully you all can see the screen. Can I get an audible yes?
Yes, we can see
All
it.
right. Beautiful. Thank you so much, team. All right. So introductions, keep them coming. I'm excited to see who's on the call. And as you are all introducing yourselves, I have to introduce our amazing team at the Housing Narrative Lab. First, I'm Marisol Bello, she, her, ella pronouns. I'm the executive director of the lab. And I work with an absolutely tremendous group of people who helped put all of the research and the guidance that you are going to see today into practice. First, I want to introduce you to Sarah Armour-Jones, who's our deputy director, and she runs the trains. She makes sure that we know where we're supposed to be, when we're supposed to be, and what we're supposed to be doing. And so she is going to moderate our Q&A today. Jeff Robinson, you all met last week. He is our research director, and he oversaw all of the research with the Lake team. Claire Sloss is our digital strategist, and I love to say that Claire reminds me of Will Smith in Men in Black when he says he makes the suit look good. Well, Claire is our Will Smith, and she makes us look good. She designed all of the decks and the guides that you are going to be using and seeing today. Grover Wayman Brown is our narrative strategist, and Grover analyzed the research and led in creating the guide that you all will receive today as well. They will join us leading our polls and the Jamboard exercise we're going to do later on. And lastly, I want to introduce Dustin Valdez, who's our project coordinator. And Dustin works on the back end, coordinating and scheduling and doing all the work that is so important, but that often goes unnoticed. And I really just need to give them a big shout out, big rounds of applause, all the things, because they are an amazing group of people that I get to work with every day. All right. So Jeff and Celinda talked about the research last week, so I won't spend too much time talking about that. But what we're going to talk about today is really looking at how to frame your work and your solutions, right? This research is all about creating a framework for you as you are doing your work on housing in Minnesota. So our goal is pretty simple. Put the research, our narrative research, into practice. It is a pretty simple goal. First, we're going to just kind of review a few of the key findings from the research. I know many of you were on the call last week, and it is a lot to digest. I'm going to digest it in 5 slides for you, all right? So we're just going to do a little bit of a quick review, because this will frame how you all will use the research to advance your housing narrative. One of the first big findings was that Minnesotans, you see housing costs as an increasingly big problem. And that language is important because Minnesotans aren't calling it a crisis, but they're seeing it increasingly as a big problem. Minnesotans, 3 in 4 Minnesotans say that inflation, or excuse me, they say that needing multiple jobs to afford housing, wages being low, and a shortage of available housing all play a role in the high cost of housing in Minnesota. So they connect economic factors to the increasing cost of housing. So that's really important as we go forward in terms of how you all are going to be thinking about your storytelling, framing your messages, and then the actual messages that you create. So again, Minnesotans connect those economic factors like multiple jobs, needing multiple jobs to afford housing, wages being too low, and a shortage of available housing, all being connected to these factors. The great thing is, right, Minnesotans really have a broad agenda for dealing with the housing issues. They're not kind of a one size fits all, right? Minnesotans get that you need to kind of approach this from a lot of different places, including having a livable wage and having job security as effective solutions to keeping people housed, as well as things like passing tenant and renter protections, as well as needing elected leaders to be involved. They very much connect job security and good paying jobs to housing, as well as the need to live near your job. So again, these economic and job factors really important to Minnesotans. Minnesotans, again, this for all of you who are Minnesotans, not a big surprise in some of these findings, but it's really important for Minnesotans to see themselves in this, right? So Minnesotans are drawn to narratives that reflect their lived experience and that show the universality of certain affordability struggles. So they want to see themselves in the issue and the solution. Oh, I love this one. So, you know, one of the things we were looking at as we were doing the testing was, do rural Minnesotans living in more rural communities, do they think about housing in the same way as maybe those living in urban communities or suburban communities? And one of the really interesting findings from this research is that folks in rural and greater Minnesota, the messages that resonate for them are similar and the same to the messages that resonate for urban and suburban Minnesotans alike. So the same top messages connect with rural, suburban, and urban Minnesotans. But as you're going to see as we talk further, how that shows up is going to be a little bit different because, again, to the point, Minnesotans want to see themselves in a lot of our both solutions and the issue. And then lastly, Minnesotans, like so many Americans, especially those in the middle of the country, they want to know how we're going to get to our goal and how they can be a part of it, right? So how are we going to accomplish the goal? So, emoji time. So in the chat, name a finding and add the emoji that best describes how you feel about that finding. And I'm going to back up one so that you can see all of the findings or most of them. Give us a finding and give me an emoji. How you feeling about that? What do you think? Feel free to put it in the chat. Give us a finding and an emoji. All right. Marin, how can our work support narrative change efforts, new messaging for our plays? Yes, I love that. Broad agenda. Let's put some emojis in there. Oh, I love that. Janicia, thank you. Love a call for including a clear call to action. We've got a hat and yay team. Housing is increasingly a big problem. Yes, Katie, very much so. Message across urban. Yeah, urban, rural, and suburban. Contrary to conventional wisdom, we thought maybe it would be a little bit different, right? Oh, there's a caution sign. Blame inflation and rising costs. Yep. Top tested messages. I love that. Yep. Yeah, that blame inflation and rising costs. That says something to us about how we need to connect systems in a different way, right? So there are going to be some of these findings, many of these findings are about helping you understand how Minnesotans are thinking, because then that will help you as you are trying to reach them about your issue or your solutions or your campaigns or whatever that looks like. Knowing how they're thinking helps you figure out how best to reach them so that they can hear you. Yeah, inclusiveness and unity. Steve, we saw that so much across the board, right? Folks really in Minnesota really want to see themselves. That inclusion piece is really important. I love it. So thank you. Please keep those emojis coming. All right, I'll go back. All right, so in a previous webinar, I talked with you all about how we're currently telling our stories and building our narratives about housing. This idea of one flower at a time. That is to say that we tell our stories in ways that are not always connected. We're using social media, we're using the digital spaces as this one-way bullhorn. And what ends up happening is that we build or create the equivalent of growing a flower at a time in a garden or a flower at a time on concrete. The wonderful, exciting thing about what we're doing today is that we're working to move your narrative from a flower in the concrete to this. And you all from a previous webinar may remember these two gifts that we use, but today we're actually going to engage in what this looks like and how to actually fill in these pieces. So this is what we get at the end of it. We talked about our narrative ecosystem, and we know that research and community values are the foundation for our narrative work. And I'm going to break apart each one of these pieces of the narrative ecosystem and how all of these pieces work together. So starting with, let's get the roadmap. What is our destination? And what does the destination look like? And I know that in the chat, someone was asking that, right? Like, what is that narrative? And so in Minnesota, here's what it looks like based on our research. Your roadmap, how do you get to your narrative destination? Here's your big narrative, right? We know making sure our families and future generations of Minnesotans can live and thrive here by making stable housing affordable. Based on the research, this is your North Star. We're going to talk about how that can show up in lots of different ways in the content that you create and in how you talk about your work. But the big narrative is making sure that our families and future generations of Minnesotans can live and thrive here by making stable housing affordable. So to get there, we know our destination. Now we kind of have to understand what the terrain is, right? What does it look like? What are we working in? So the narrative landscape. We know that Minnesotans think that housing is a basic need. We know that they think it's becoming a bigger problem to afford. We know that Minnesotans see a role for state and local government as well as housing and land developers. They see these four entities as having major roles, especially the state, and that they see broad solutions for housing affordability. This is really helpful for us as we're thinking this through, because Minnesotans are not seeing a one-size-fits-all answer. They're seeing everything from tenant and renter protections all the way through to job security and a livable wage, all the way through government, the role of government in this. Lastly, they need to see themselves in the issue and the solution. And we're going to come back to that so much, because that is that piece about unity and community that made so many of you smile in your emojis, right? So, destination, we understand the landscape. Let's understand Minnesotans a little bit more. So when we do this research, and Celinda talked about this last week, we look at the base, the persuadables, and the opposition. The base are the people that we want to mobilize, right? Those are the folks that are generally on our side. They agree with us on a lot of the issues. They want government involved. They see how people of color, how immigrant communities are impacted in different ways because of the role of race in so much of our life. Persuadables are the folks who can kind of go one way or the other. They are the folks that, again, you might know them as the movable middle. They're the folks, though, that believe two things at the same time, right? So in Minnesota, they're the folks who believe that economic factors like inflation contribute to high housing. They're the folks who also support a livable wage, and they're more concerned about crime just generally than the base. And again, the persuadables are the people we can move, but they're the folks that you want to be really thinking about when you are talking to them, because language, the way you approach them, it's going to matter with this group. This is where, when we talk about the language of replace and embrace, that it's not just wordsmithing. It is about how people, right? The language you use matters because it's how people are going to hear you. It's going to resonate with them. And with this group in particular, it's going to matter. Opposition. So Linda talked about them, like those are the people that you're not inviting to your birthday party. Really, like they're the folks that you're just not going to sway. No matter how hard you try. So our work is always in exciting our base and getting them mobilized, and then moving persuadables so that they can join our movements. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the subgroups of Minnesotans. And this is important because Minnesotans, again, we know that overwhelmingly, Minnesotans believe in additional funding for housing, right? Like statewide, they're there with you. The thing about Minnesotans that you want to think about as you are framing your various solutions and various work is in how you talk about it, particularly with the persuadables, groups in rural communities, and a segment of Black Minnesotans. They can be a little sensitive to language that says, quote unquote, even if it increases your taxes. So again, when you think about the findings, this is about how to help you talk about your solutions and frame your solutions and your campaigns and your work in ways that are going to resonate and people will hear you. So again, Minnesotans in the northern part of Minnesota, rural residents, some Black Minnesotans can be a little bit more tax sensitive. We also know that there's a plurality of Minnesotans who do not believe that race plays a role in housing affordability, particularly with persuadables, somewhat with rural Minnesotans. And again, these findings are then about helping you, right, talk about some of your issues in ways that will resonate with your different audiences, because Minnesotans share many of the same values, but how you talk to your different audiences is going to matter as you move forward. So it's important to understand the state and the various pockets of the state. And then lastly, you want to think about, and this is why understanding your audiences are important, because you want to think about the framing and the messages that are going to work. So again, really key. We're going to revisit this so often during our time together. Lean into community and unity, right? Emphasize communities are stronger when everyone has a stable home they can afford. Tie together us, right? Us, not just others, but others are part of us, right? Our loved ones and other Minnesotans. And then lastly, connect that housing and financial struggles to the need for higher wages and economic support. So again, connecting the economic factors to housing. These are, again, just really important critical pieces about how you're framing and messaging for Minnesotans. Oops, excuse me. I think I jumped a little too fast there. All right. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how that narrative landscape shows up in our framing. And again, framing is really about the choices we make in what we say and how we say it, what we emphasize, what we explain, what we don't explain. Are we going to focus our conversations and our messaging around policy, or are we going to focus them around the story? And these choices are really important because they affect how people hear us. They affect what they understand, and ultimately then how they're going to act on a particular issue. So the science of framing is what helps us to be heard and understood. And this is where the research is going to be so valuable to all of you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about framing. First, people are influenced by how information is presented to them. So as a famous pollster says, it's not just what you say, it's what people hear. And then in Minnesota, right, what that means is talking about and presenting information in ways that connects how we and other Minnesotans and future generations can live and thrive in the state when we have stable housing that is affordable. Remember our big narrative, connecting how us and our families and future Minnesotans can live and thrive here when we all have housing we can afford. That's the first thing. The second about how we present information is Minnesotans respond to coming together to solve problems, when they see themselves in the solution. That is that point of Minnesotans need to see themselves in the issues and they need to see themselves in the solutions. So that's the first piece about as you are thinking of how you frame, how are you approaching your conversations, your messaging, your communications? One is connecting the us and the we to thriving and living in Minnesota with stable housing, affordable housing. Two, unity and inclusion. What we emphasize, so some key pieces, again, what we emphasize in Minnesota, some key pieces. Emphasizing how local and state and housing and land developers can play roles. We saw from the research that these four entities are places and are institutions and people that Minnesotans do see have a major role to play in housing affordability. Two is connecting jobs and housing. That economics piece is pretty critical, right? We saw across the board connecting a living wage, connecting how workers benefit when they afford a place, when they can afford a place to live, and how that creates a stronger Minnesota is a really important piece. And then lastly, being able to live near your job really resonated for so many Minnesotans. And then the third piece about what we're emphasizing, specific solutions. The solutions like a livable wage, passing renter and tenant protections, regulations that limit housing costs, and investing more public funds. Again, to that point of the broad agenda that Minnesotans see. They do not see a one-size-fits-all, which is a really important thing for all of you as you move forward on both your work and your solutions and all of your efforts. What we emphasize, so third, how and what we explain. This is really critical because our job is to connect the dots, be explicit. I'll give you an example that's actually a national example. So the Washington Post, I think it was late last week, wrote a story about nationally, a report that came out that showed how rents were rising at astronomical rates. You probably all saw this national story too, because it was in a lot of different places. Here's the thing though, this story talked about these rising astronomical rates and how people were spending almost half of their household income on rent. And guess what the story never did? It never stated implicitly or explicitly the natural consequences of what happens when you can't afford rent, right? People that are doubled up, people that have to move to unsafe or low quality places to live, people that become homeless. Story never did that. It kind of just left it to the reader. It just said, like, here are the costs, the rising costs, and all of us are feeling this rent squeeze. But it never kind of connected the consequences of it. Our job is to connect those dots, to connect those consequences, because I think people may know it somewhere in their recesses of their minds, but it's not as explicit. And our job is to make those connections explicit. So show how a thriving and strong Minnesota means and relies on housing that everyone can afford. Strong Minnesota equals housing that we can all afford. Tie together how high housing costs tied together high housing costs to things like inflation, to things like a livable wage, right? To housing that we can afford. I'm gonna sound a little bit like a broken record for all of y'all, but you get the point here, right? How and what we explain. Do not take it for granted that your audiences are gonna make those connections naturally. And then lastly, asset framing, right? We talked a little bit about asset framing earlier. For those of you that are really in comms, and deep in comms work, this will be familiar to you. This is something that the communicator Travian Shorters talks a lot about, which is asset framing, state their best before the rest. So when you are talking about individuals and people in your community, talking about your community, what is it you want? What is that aspiration? What is it that the individuals or the people are contributing to your community? Right? Define people by your aspirations and by your North Star. So we are going to do another question. All right, what element of framing will you focus on first? So I'm going to go back, okay, in the chat. Tell us, what element of framing are you going to focus on first? Join us in the chat. Again, you can interpret this in terms of what's resonating for you, or interpret this as, I'm going to start connecting dots, or I'm going to start using asset framing more. Tell us a little bit about what you are going to be. Oh, assets. Yes, asset framing. That is the thing, right? State their best before the rest. I always quote Travian Shorters when he talks about that. Thank you, Hillary. Who else? What else are you going to be using first? Connecting the dots more specifically. I think we take it for granted, don't we, sometimes? Where we live and breathe our work, and we take it for granted that folks kind of are there with us too, but sometimes they're not. They're not making those explicit connections that we are. Others. Yep, the North Star. It's really important when we think about using that North Star to tell our stories. Yeah. Janicia says, my goal is not to assume everyone knows the terms we may use. Yes, leave the wonk and our language of housing at home, right? Our policy language. Nobody knows what CDFI is. I'm with you, Janicia. So really explaining for people. Yeah. Yes. The now, the loss of human potential and loss of life. Yep. Thank you, Linda. That's where it becomes really important to talk about how a strong Minnesota, a thriving Minnesota, right? Our communities being strong relies on us being able to have housing we can afford. Dan says, how and what we explain. What matters to me as a housing professional may not matter at all to the general public. So being intentional about what we lift up and what we set aside. Yep, I love that. What we lift up and why. So we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to our narrative essentials. Yep, thank you so much. Nathaniel says, maybe connected personally to the fact that as a result of higher costs of housing, we're all at risk. That is the piece, right? So when we talk about what's at risk, we're framing it in the way of helping people to understand that for us to have a strong Minnesota means all of us need to be able to afford the rent, or else we become at risk of not having a house and we weaken our state, right? So really framing that. I love that. Thank you, Nathaniel. Wonderful. Keep those coming. All right. So before we get to our poll, I just want to recap the messages, because we had 3 key messages that really were that really lifted up for us in the research. And messaging, when we are thinking about messaging, we're thinking about the words, the images, the sounds that we use to tell our stories, right? The sounds, the words, the images we use to advance that big narrative that we talked about earlier. And so this knowing the messages becomes really important because it helps you then create that scale, consistency, and repetition throughout all of Minnesota, where folks are thinking about that big narrative. So let's dig in a little bit into some of the three narratives. I'm gonna, again, you heard them last week, you're gonna hear them again because they're gonna shape a little bit more about how we are gonna talk about the research in action. So these are the top messages. I'm gonna play the first one. This one is Minnesota Strong.
When hard-working Minnesotans, from teachers and nurses to firefighters and waitresses, are struggling to keep up with rising housing costs in our community, you know there's a problem. When everyone, including the people who work in everyday regular jobs, can afford to live near where they work, our communities are not only better, they're also stronger. Affordable housing of all kinds is key to thriving communities, attracting good employers, improving the economic well-being for families, and growing the middle class.
You can see, again, you saw the actual dials last week, but this was a really key message. Our base especially really loves that idea of our communities are not only better, they're also stronger. So that's message one, Minnesota Strong. All right. Message two, Minnesota Together.
Whether we're digging each other out of the snow or sharing a meal, Minnesota is a place where we look out for each other. Today, we face many challenges: creating good jobs, revitalizing our schools, and ensuring everyone has a safe, secure place to live. We need our elected officials and community leaders to implement new solutions that will make this a fair, affordable, and prosperous place to live. We need policies that put housing within reach for everyone.
Again, you can see some similar themes, right? That idea of all of us as Minnesotans coming together, right? That shared value of the we as Minnesotans. You can see here too, there's a lot of, there's some dial-up for our base and our persuadables around solutions. Opposition, again, you can see that they start to peel out or peel off, right? And then the last one is vibrant, secure, and thriving.
Stable housing should not be something you have to think about, and it should be something that families can count on every day. But today, many Minnesotans know all too well the struggle to find a place to live, make rent, or cover our mortgage. Making sure people, whether our loved ones or complete strangers, have a safe place to lay their heads at night means our neighborhoods are more vibrant, our communities are more secure, and our state thrives.
And this was great because it says, starts with a shared value. Like we should, housing, stable housing shouldn't be something we all have to think about. And then it tells you what the problem is, right? That not all of us can afford it. But again, really rooted in that community element, right? That us. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Grover, who is going to lead us in a poll exercise.
Thanks, Marisol. So everyone, you should see a little pop-up box come up on your Zoom window that's asking a question. I see some of you are clicking it now. So go ahead and click. Which message do you see yourself using the most for your organization, your community, the kinds of people you're communicating to, or really the one that resonated most with you as the most effective? Excellent. I see a lot of people participating. Let's keep it coming. I'll leave this up for about 20 more seconds, so get your vote in. Minnesota Strong, Minnesota Together, or Vibrant, Secure, and Thriving. Those are listed in the order that Marisol talked through them. So last chance. Go ahead and vote, and I will share the results. Okay, we are going to wrap it up and share the results here. Minnesota Together pulled out slightly in front, with Minnesota Strong and Vibrant, Secure, and Thriving tied in the back. So can someone who voted for Minnesota Together volunteer to unmute and tell me, why did that message stand out for you? "22 people voted for it. I bet that there's someone here."
I love the first line. It's just so Minnesotan. I mean, you cannot get stuck in the snow here without a neighbor coming to help you. So I just love how it starts.
Great. So the opening line, whether we're digging each other out of the snow or sharing a meal, really resonated. But let's hear one other person. Minnesota Together.
I think that one of the things that struck me was that this whole thing of togetherness, and if we really take a deep dive, that with candor, that at some point it will offset the things that ail us and bring us all together, including Minnesota Nice.
Excellent. Yes. The unity, community, and togetherness as the emphasis. Thank you. And I got a message from somebody, and because you direct messaged me, I'm going to assume maybe you want it to be anonymous, but they said, "I chose Minnesota Strong because it did best among the opposition, and that is necessary to do in my work," which is interesting. And if you can see Marisol's moved to that message, who else voted for Minnesota Strong? And, you know, this was a top message across groups. So I'm curious, as somebody who tends to communicate more with our base or persuadables, why did you choose this message? You can put it in the chat or you can unmute. Okay, my says it's inclusive, tangible, and relatable. Oh, Michael, go ahead.
I chose it because it said housing of all types, which I think we need our communities to embrace.
Excellent. Housing of all types. Thank you. And Nathaniel said connects to real people that we may know facing housing instability. All right, so because it's specific with real people like nurses, firefighters, waitresses. Excellent, thank you. And if there's one person who can share Vibrant, Secure, and Thriving, because that also was really up there.
I can share.
Yeah.
So I think in answering the question around like which one do I see myself in the most, what I remember from that one is that it tended to test a little higher with folks who saw themselves or were coming from more urban settings, and also as someone whose family came to Minnesota from another place. That place is Chicago, so I've said it now, but who came to Minnesota from another place. The other messages for me personally as a Minnesotan, as a person who lives in Minnesota, the vibrant, secure, like coming from a larger city, coming here, it really vibes with me, like if I were listening to the messaging. But I also like the other ones for like our work and for reasons that people identify. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that perspective. And I think that's a really great point, that while this messaging emphasizes Minnesotans, some people that might not be their primary identity or way of thinking, right? And also your emphasis of where the messages of thriving resonated in urban communities, that was apparent in the data. And yeah, that's a great reason to choose a message. So thank you. All right, thank you.
just interrupt. So in Golden Valley, I mostly speak to the city council, and I chose the vibrant, secure, and thriving because I think that they think that's their job as city council members, and so that's why I chose it.
Excellent. Strategic communication decisions at work right there. This is great. Thanks. All right, back to you, Marisol.
Super. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. All right. So now we are actually going to get into the research and action and the ways that so much of what we've talked about can look like in the various ways that you work. So, research and action. Number one, the first thing, if there's one thing that we want you all to walk away with, is establish shared value. When you are approaching folks, come at them with the thing that is important to them that connects with the thing that is important to you. In Minnesota, folks know and believe that housing is a basic need that everyone should have access to and should be able to afford. So here are 3 examples in terms of how it can show up. And I'm not quite sure where these blue lines came from. I don't know if others can see them or if it's just me. But they seem to have kind of shown up here by accident somehow. So we're going to maneuver through them a little bit. But first, you can see a graphic here where we show a young couple with a child. Minnesota is stronger when everyone can afford a safe and stable home. Picture below it, clearly a rural community. And then there's a slightly more urban vision where it says it's become harder to afford living here now. So we need to build more housing of all kinds. I know someone mentioned they love that language of housing of all kinds. So here are some ways where this can show up for all of you. Shared value. Here's another example for you. This is a gift. Minnesota is stronger when everyone can afford a safe and stable home. And I don't think there's sound on this, but it really shows you. I'll show it one more time. Lots of different images of Minnesota. Minnesota is stronger when everyone can afford a safe and stable home. Again, to that narrative, that shared narrative. We are stronger when we make sure our families and future generations of Minnesotans can live and thrive here by making stable housing affordable. Some examples of the ways that that shared value can come into play. Here's one more, actually. I love this one. Whether we're digging each other out of the snow or sharing a meal, Minnesota is a place where we look out for each other, right? Quintessential Minnesota, you know snow, you know potlucks. And so here was a piece we actually saw on Medium where an artist was turning to performance art and doing this Heartside community meal. So this is a way that it actually showed up in some writing by a local artist or by a national artist, excuse me. So you can see different ways. There's not one size, again, just like Minnesotans know, there's not one size fits all solutions. There is no one size fits all way of being able to advance our narratives. So first is shared value. The second is lean into unity and community. Remember how I talked about Minnesotans need to see themselves. They want to see themselves in both the issue and the solution. And so when we think about, many of you may be familiar with the race class narrative work that so many of your colleagues in Minnesota and fellow residents in Minnesota have engaged in, right? Naming race, naming class, naming geographies. So in this community in Minnesota, naming race looks like this. I want my community to be a place where everyone, young and old, Black and white, Minnesota born and newcomer, rural and city, has a place to call home that enables us to do and be our very best. Right? So that's I want a community that looks like this. And ensuring in all of your work that you are showing the wide breadth and beautiful breadth of what it means to be a Minnesotan becomes really important. Again, naming race, making sure that every Minnesotan, whether we're Black, white, Native, or newcomer, has a safe place to lay their heads at night. Here's another way that this can look like, right? No matter our race, gender, or income, we all want to get and keep a roof over our heads. Leaning into unity and community. Second, research and action essential. And then showing people working together. I know that the Minnesota Together message resonated. Here's what it could look like in content form. Lending a hand is part of what makes Minnesota strong. No matter what we look like or where we're from, we need a home we can afford. So we can be here for each other. You can add some fun music to it, Minnesota music to it, but that's what it looks like when you bring all of these elements together. So leaning into unity and community, number two. Number three, be specific. Remember when I said connect the dots, right? And be specific and be explicit, right? This is part of that. Be specific, show, don't tell. Show how we and us can solve this together, right? So making sure that the state invests in building more housing that people can afford so our families and future generations can live and thrive here. Here's what it looks like when you are showing different members of your community. So here's a firefighter talking about, while I was in training, I didn't have enough money for rent, so I had to sleep on a friend's couch. Or a delivery worker, right? I've been working 10 hours a day delivering packages, but when my landlord raised the rent, I had to move out. Or a teacher, rent is too high and I can't find an affordable place for my family and I to live. So these are show, don't tell. These are these folks talking about their experiences, and we're showing them, right, who they are, Minnesotans across the board. Lived experience. I'm a former reporter, so I live in a show, don't tell world. And so really being able to show people the connection. In this case, in Minnesota, they need to know the connection. They need to see the connection between housing, housing insecurity, housing affordability, those connections between jobs, the connection between education and well-being, public safety. So every Twin Cities graduate should be able to afford to live in their hometown. It's another way to really kind of show that connection between housing and jobs and education. Here's another example of a Facebook post from a would-be local entrepreneur about how their business can't grow or survive unless you have a reliable workforce. Another way to show that lived experience. Name root causes. Okay, so name root causes with the problem. We're all feeling the housing crunch. There's not enough and it's too expensive. Oh, let me back up for 1 second. Thought I had more here. All right. I actually just wanted to add one more thing around the root causes. So here we're talking, just as an example, I'm going to play one more time. We're feeling the housing crunch. That's the first piece of it. And then the second piece of it is that there's not enough housing and it's too expensive. Those are systemic problems. Those are systemic root causes, but we don't say that anywhere in here. There's no wonk. We're not using the phrase systemic, right? We're not using the phrase root causes, but we are showing people here what the challenge is nonetheless. Focus on solutions, right? So we want to show what we are for and how we're going to get there. I said earlier that Minnesotans, like so many folks, so many Americans, but especially so many folks in the middle of the country, y'all want the solutions. You want to know what is our goal and how we're going to get there and what is our way to get there together. So here again is another example talking about how Minnesotans want their political and community leaders to come together for real solutions. So here we use that earlier graphic about every Twin City graduate should be able to afford to live in their hometown, but we also are showing a post where we say no matter our race and our gender, every graduate should be able to afford where they live, to live in their hometown, excuse me, but the cost of rent is too high and we need our elected officials to do a thing. Our elected officials and community leaders. One of the things I'll just add from the research is that when we blame elected officials, it was polarizing for Minnesotans. But when we talked about elected officials and community leaders, elected officials and housing and land developers, when we talked about groups coming together to find solutions, that resonated with Minnesotans. Here's one more. Again, explicitly connecting livable wages, job security, and living near work. Those were really key elements around that economic piece and the jobs piece for Minnesotans. A livable wage, job security, and living near your work. Being able to afford to live near your work. I'll show you this video one more time. We all need good jobs and affordable, decent housing nearby. So again, you can see how these pieces come together in content as you are thinking through how to reach your different communities. And then lastly, a compelling call to action. Again, I mentioned how Minnesotans want to see themselves in the solution. And that cuts across Minnesotans, cuts across all of us, right? Our audiences, our people, we want to engage in something, right? We want to first, as the organizations and the people doing this work, we want to give our audiences something to do so that they can see themselves in the story, so that they too can be a hero in the story. But recognizing that people join us because they want to be a part of something becomes even more critical for us to give them something to do. So here's another Facebook post that gives you an example of what to do, right? How do we turn our situation around? Click here to tell our leaders we need more housing that's affordable to all of us. One more, tell our legislators that Minnesotans, no matter what part of the state we live in and what we look like, need a home we can afford. And then the last two pieces about our research and action, as you are moving forward, always be clear on your goal, right? Why are you doing this? What are you trying to accomplish? Because when you know that, then you can really tailor your messages and frame your messages to your target audiences. So you know how you are talking to them and how you are framing your work and your solutions to them so that they will hear us. Again, it's not just what you say, it's how people hear it. So again, so the base, they're mostly going to agree with us. They're going to be a group that we want to mobilize in Minnesota. It looks like the base is mostly made up of women, people of color, Democrats, households with incomes of $50,000 or more, and they do tend to be mostly urban. Your persuadables, again, those are the people that are kind of in the middle. They believe both base, right? They really support a lot of our base thinking, but they also have some thoughts that probably are more in line with the opposition. So depending on how you talk to them becomes really critical whether or not they're going to move towards the opposition side or they're going to move more towards the base. Again, and in Minnesota, they're mostly white. They're mostly over 45 years old, non-college, and again, they also have household incomes of $50,000 or more. You may wonder about the opposition. Honestly, I didn't put them in here because they're mostly going to be the folks that, those are not really the folks you want to reach. You really want to engage in the persuadables. So I do recognize that there were some folks here who mentioned that you want to reach out to the persuadables. And for you all, in both the research findings and the full research, you're going to see some more specifics around opposition. That will be helpful to you all as you're crafting your messages and your framing. So that's not to say that we don't have information in there for the opposition, but in this particular presentation, I've really zeroed in on the base and the persuadables. So I'm going to turn it over to Grover, who's going to talk a little bit and walk us through a little bit about how we want you all to engage in thinking about these research essentials. So Grover, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, great. Thanks, Marisol. So now we're going to do an exercise together, and I just put a link in the chat. It's called a Jamboard. It's kind of like as if we were in a room working on white paper with sticky notes. And it looks like this. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So if you could click the link in the chat and open it up. And our question to you is, which one of these research and action essentials will you use the most? Or do you find the most compelling for your work? So you see this is a note here. You can click the little white tabs up here at the top, duplicate it, and move it to the center. And we're going to take a few minutes to do that. You could also click right here, sticky note, get a brand new one, and start typing. So 2 options of ways to use the sticky boards. And I'm going to go look through and I'm going to start putting them together. So we have a lot of established shared values. They're going to hang out together. And let us know, which of these research and actions essentials are you going to use the most? Be clear. Great. And once you've answered that, then go over here to the right-hand side. Why? I see people are starting to duplicate and move them around. I hope that means you're typing in new content. So why are you using that essential? Why are you gonna start with lean into community or establish shared values? What is it gonna do for your work? We have here a lot of established shared values, an increasing amount of provide a clear call to action. Excellent, excellent. And here we're going to talk about why. Someone here says we cannot societally improve until people understand the root causes so we don't repeat them. And another person says looking at the root causes resonates as beginning at the beginning. Excellent. And this blue sticky says the sharing of values brings us together and then we can talk about solutions. Yes, that is an important understanding of how people change, how they make decisions and how we work together. This person says, as an organization that is trying to create a shared identity across our supporters, shared values is an essential tool creating and showing that shared identity. Focus on solutions. Someone said, people need to feel that they have power to make a change. There's room and need for everyone. How do I take the next step and not just feel stuck? Yes. The person who just put accept that there is an issue. I'm curious which shared value was in there before that you think will help people accept that there's an issue and need to address it. You're welcome to come off mute if you want.
So to accept that there is an issue and move to address it means, the inequities that exist in housing due to race, class, social status, things like that. If we just talk about it and we don't accept it, then that's all it is. It's just talk. It's placating. It's fancy words. It's buzzwords that get a conversation going, but there's no action. There's only action when we all accept that it is a problem and we start moving forward around that problem to address it versus just talking about it, if that helps.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. And the person who says trying to create affordable housing in a wealthy community that is resistant to accepting it, we need to decrease the fear by showing commonalities. I'm curious if that was establishing shared values or lean into community and unity. That was the value you started with?
It was establishing shared values.
Great, thank you. Excellent. But we got so much going on in here. So feel free to take a look. If I didn't get to read out a sticky note, take a look at what other people have shared and are sharing. And thank you so much for participating. And I'm going to pass it back to Marisol.
Great. Thank you, Grover. All right, I will go back and share my screen. I'm going to talk a little bit, actually, this was so great because someone just mentions about accepting some elements. And so I actually am going to jump into the last few minutes because I really want to give us some ample opportunity for questions. But I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling, which I think is going to be a really critical piece about, is really critical when we're thinking about things like acceptance, particularly acceptance with groups of people that may not be there with us already. How then do we move them to start to accept, right? Because us telling them you have to accept it probably is not going to be as effective as we want it to be. And so thinking about how do we communicate with these folks in a way that they will hear us and start to accept what we know as a reality, right? Storytelling is really it. Storytelling is about how we as people, as humans, communicate. Storytelling and stories are how we build trust and connection and empathy. It's the reason why so many of us who work together on projects and campaigns and are in the work can start to, you often will have folks, right, that are just like friends and colleagues for so long. And it's because we really kind of went through this shared experience and we have these shared stories that we will talk about. And we've spent so much time building trust and connection and empathy with each other. And stories, again, for us is really a key way to do that. And I don't mean just us on this call, I mean us as humans. So I want to talk for a few minutes about stories and how they literally are the single most powerful tool that we have in our toolbox. Maya Angelou, you all will be familiar. So many of you will be familiar with this quote. She says, people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So one of the things that I want us to think about as we move forward is connecting the stories and emotions that we want people to be feeling and connecting them to the research and to action. Because here's the reality. People act based on how they feel. So we always think about wanting to give people the facts and sort of their all of the data and the numbers and those kinds of things. The reality is that people take action based on how they feel about something, and how they feel about something then shapes how they think about something, and that's where we get the action. So for us, we want to elicit certain we want to move people to certain emotions because we are trying to build movement. We want to have people sit in an inclusive, more open space. And to do that means that we elicit these kinds of emotions because these are the emotions that move people to action. Pride, hope, humor, love, awe, and empowerment. Some of these are emotions that we want to use sparingly. Anger, fear, and sadness. They will get people to action, but they won't keep people there in the long term. So as we think about building movement, working on long-term campaigns, the emotions that people will sit in longer are emotions of pride, emotions of hope, humor, love, awe, and empowerment. Anger, fear, and sadness, they work in the short term and they work quickly, but they won't last forever. They're actually short-term emotions, and they also elicit action that closes people off. So it becomes more of an action around protecting what's theirs. And so that doesn't necessarily go with where we need to move people when we think about our broader solutions. So we're going to do one more poll together. And this is, which emotion does the research most point you to evoke in your story? So thinking about the research, we talked about the framing, we talked about research in action. And now we're talking about how do we get people to this place? We know emotions are what people will take action based on how they feel. So based on the research and knowing cognitively that people will take action based on how they feel, what emotion is the research pointing you most to evoke in the stories and in the communications that you are going to be engaging in with your work and your solutions and your approaches? And I'll turn that over. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm going to turn that over to Grover.
Thanks, Marisol. So the poll is released, and the question is, which one of these emotions does the research most point you to evoke in your stories? And some people have already started voting, but let's light it up. There's 75 people on this call, and we haven't quite reached half the people voting. So if you're able to, if you're in a safe place to open up the screen and click, which of these emotions does the research most call you to evoke in your stories? And I'll leave the poll up for another 10, 20 seconds more. See if we can get us a little past halfway participation. And Steve, your question, yeah, I think it does mean paternal love or parental love. Thanks for that reframe around gender there. And okay, and I'm gonna stop the poll. Let's see what the top emotion was right here. So top emotion for empowerment, with hope as a close second. Yeah, so was somebody who voted for empowerment, what do you think empowerment does to help people move with you?
I can jump in again. I didn't know which one to pick initially, but I did pick empowerment because I was thinking about one, framing when we do need to frame stories around folks that we're working with that are coming from, different communities that are, pushed to the margins. Like, I want to make sure that that's always there, right? One, as a professional, and second, also as a person who is sharing in those experiences. The way we talk about our community members matters. And that's what we've been talking about the whole time here, in these webinars. And then second, I was thinking about empowerment as a way to sort of connect with the idea about the clear call to action. And so, like, even if someone doesn't necessarily see themselves in the story that we're sharing, or if in our case, we're sharing something that isn't necessarily like an emotional connecting story or super strong narrative story, but it's maybe just kind of telling the facts of some work we did. That sense of like, this is how it all connects. This is how, we're all kind of existing in this, well, not to overuse ecosystem, but we're existing in this ecosystem of change. And so that empowerment, I think it also connects to the sense of call to action or call to connection. So that's why I picked it.
Yes, thank you so much there, both in terms of empowering the stories we tell about and for our community members, which, Marisol used the word asset framing, but essentially that's what that is. And also empowering people to action. That's excellent. How about hope? Who voted hope and would like to say why you think that emotion is a powerful one for your work? You can unmute, you can put it in the chat. Do you find people are generally hopeful, or do we need to infuse more hope into our stories? That's a leading question, because I would be surprised to hear somebody say that the general temperature is hopeful.
Hi, this is Julie Pinamaki.
Yeah.
I voted for hope, and it just seems so obvious to me that it's hard actually to come up with an explanation. It just seems like the types, I don't know, things that we are drawn to, hope, and I don't really know how to explain it. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. People are drawn to it. That's great. Thank you.
And I chose empowerment because I think there's something to be said for, folks rising from the ashes, if you will, as well as adding to that, that it will work against continued homelessness.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's important.
I agree. I also chose empowerment just because there's, in our day and age where we're dealing with, the same generational issues of housing and policy and things that have held people back from not only home ownership, but attaining safe, decent, and affordable housing. A lot of people don't know that they do have the ability to become involved, that they do have a voice that they can go to with legislators and change makers and people within the community. And without them knowing that, we need that empowerment if we're going to make a change. People need to know that they have every right to be empowered towards actionable items and change.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Excellent, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to pass it back to Marisol to move on to whatever's next, but thank you for sharing your thoughts and your opinions and your stories.
Great. Thank you so much, Grover. We're actually at the tail end. I wanted to just share one other thing with you all. We already did our discussion. And you will see this in the message guide, which is words to replace and embrace. And the thing I want you all to be thinking about is that this is, people might have a tendency to say, well, this is just wordsmithing. The thing that we want you to walk away with when you're thinking about the words you use and why they matter is because different words will reach different people. And they will either reach them in a way that you want them to reach them, or they will open the doors widely and welcome you in, or they're going to say, you know what, I'm going to close the door, shut my windows, close the curtains, turning off the lights because I have no Halloween candy, right? And I grew up in the Bronx, and this is what people did when they did not have Halloween candy. But so it becomes really important for you all as you are thinking about how to reach your audiences. And so we've included both in the message guide, and I want to just share this with you. And it is things like Minnesota has a housing crisis. Minnesotans don't think in terms of crisis. They think in terms of affording a place to live, a home, housing in Minnesota is an increasingly big problem. They think about, instead of multifamily housing, they're thinking about new housing in neighborhoods that people of all incomes can afford. They think about passing renter and tenant protections. They think about, I want every Minnesotan, no matter who we are, to have a place to call home in our community so we can thrive. So you can see there are some really specific examples here around really rooted in how to reach Minnesotans. So this becomes really important, especially as you are thinking about how am I reaching our varying communities in Minnesota. So I'm going to stop there because I really wanted, we threw so much at you over the course of this period of time with this really exciting project. And it's going to take a minute to process it all and think about, what am I going to do today? The good thing is you don't have to do all of the research and action elements and pieces all in one shot. So you can focus on, over the next 30 days, you know what? I'm going to do shared values. All of our communications, they're going to have shared values. And then maybe the next month you can engage in another piece of it, right? So think of it in that kind of like building blocks. So I'm going to stop there because I really want to open up questions. My colleague Sarah will moderate us. I want to open up for Grover, Sarah, Claire on our team. And I think Jeff, I actually wasn't sure if he was on or not. So folks, we can all jump in with any of the questions.
That's great. Thank you, Marisol. Michael, I see your hand up. I just want to get to some of the questions that were asked earlier in the chat. So I'm going to read them off and Marisol can answer. So let's start off. We had a couple of data questions earlier on. One question was, does the message resonate across different generations? And so that was one question about the data. And then a second one was about calls to action. Does this include, is there a range of actions, including donate now, call your lawmaker, vote yes? Did we test calls to action? So I just want to see if Marisol can speak to those two questions first.
Yes, absolutely. First on the age, the 3 messages tested well for across age, race, income levels, and geographies. And then if you will receive the full report, if you really want to nerd out a little bit more specifically, the full report will tell you this specific piece or this specific language resonated with people over 45 or people over 60. So you can dig into the full report that will have some of those key messages, but the 3 that we lifted up really resonated, and Minnesotans across all of those age groups and income groups and racial groups and geographic groups, those were the ones that resonated for all of them. And then to your second question, which was, sorry, Sarah.
That's okay. That was, were there calls to action that were tested? So in previous webinars, we highlighted messaging that's most impactful with a call to action. Lake Research sort of mentioned that. Was that part of this research?
One of the things we saw from the research was that we do need to have stronger calls to action. So when we tested having elected leaders, that was a little bit polarizing. But when we tested elected and community leaders, because we did some split sampling, so some of the respondents received some messages, others received others. But we saw that combination of elected leaders and community leaders resonated well. And that really points to the idea of how Minnesotans think about unity, right? That unity piece of folks coming together. But one of the clear walkaways in the findings is we need to have clearer, more specific calls to action, like pass tenant and rent protections, like more public investment in housing. But you're going to see from the research as you dig in that there's going to be some specifics and some things that you need to watch out for in terms of potential pitfalls, right? So talking about renter protections, if you mention evictions, doesn't resonate as much. Talking about public investment, if you mention specific language about increasing your taxes, doesn't resonate as much. So just being really aware that you have these solutions, being really aware that Minnesotans support these solutions pretty overwhelmingly, but they hear it slightly differently depending on how you approach them and how you talk about it. And that's going to be really key. And you can dig into the full report and even the presentation deck, but the full report will give you a little bit more specifics around that.
That actually feeds really nicely into two bunched questions, and then Michael will pass it over to you. So Linda asked how not to feed the resistance, like what will antagonists use against us? And then Scarlett also asked, how can this messaging be used to address the sort of ongoing hangups in housing development, antiquated zoning, land use policies, political will, like how to move us from the 1950s to the 2024. So maybe those can be asked or answered in combination.
I think I lost the thread on the second one, but let's talk about the opposition first. this is where understanding your pitfalls becomes really important, right? We know that Minnesotans, there is a segment of Minnesotans that believe several things. One is, particularly in rural and greater Minnesota communities, and to a somewhat of an extent with Black Minnesotans, that when you use language like increase your taxes, right, that is a weakness and a potential pitfall. So that's where opposition might come in, right? So it becomes really important then for you all to be talking about and thinking about both the need for public investment in this broader context of how Minnesotans overwhelmingly support and believe both public investment and passing tenant and renter protections in order to strengthen Minnesota, in order to have a strong Minnesota, a Minnesota that works for all of us, and that one that's going to be strong for my family, your family, and future generations. We need to invest in these things so that everyone could have a home they can afford. It becomes really important to be thinking about how you are framing these things so that the opposition, right, because that's where a lot of the opposition can come in. The other piece is around race. Really, we know that a plurality of Minnesotans, and this includes people of color, do not believe that race plays a factor in housing affordability. So when we talk about all of us, a Minnesota that we can create where we see each of us, no matter the color of your skin, how much income you have, what part of the state you live in, whether you came in yesterday or you've been here for 7 generations, we want a Minnesota where all of us can thrive. And that means being able to afford a place to live. That resonates. So really leaning in the shared values when we start talking about our solutions and our various efforts becomes really important. Grover, Sarah, Claire, anything else to that particular question? Yeah, Miss Jackson, that is a tall order. That's why it's really good. It becomes important for you all to pick like one. You don't have to do the whole thing, right? Just like one piece of this at a time becomes important. And also, you all are coming in to this work in lots of different ways, and you have lots of different audiences. So you don't have to speak to all of these audiences. Focus on the audience that you are working with and how to talk with that audience to get them to mobilize if they are your base. For those of you that have to work with more of a persuadable audience, focus on them. And I know that there was a group that earlier mentioned having to reach out to opposition. There's a way to reach out to them, right? But this is where we can dig in a little bit more for those of you that want to. We'll go to the full report, and I'm happy to engage with you all a little further on that particular piece, right? But there are ways that you can talk to the opposition. Again, that element of all of us, a stronger Minnesota, and all of us striving and thriving in order to have a stronger Minnesota, that cuts across all Minnesotans. Doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter whether you're based, persuadable oppositions, that is language that all Minnesotans are going to hang with. The opposition is going to start to peel off when we talk about solution.
And I think actually that really summed up sort of Scarlett's question about like, how do you get to all these complex things that have really held us back? I want to turn it over to Michael, who had his hand up earlier. Michael, do you want to ask your question?
So I love most of what I'm hearing. I want to start that off by saying that. But when we go to decision, and I understand we're talking about community, but when we go to decision makers, they need to know issues that they can solve. And sometimes that's very particular, like when we want to increase the home ownership, especially amongst Black Minnesotans, but we design programs that don't help them. Or when we want to design housing for low-income Minnesotans, and we end up getting at middle-income Minnesotans instead through the programs. And so I want to know how to talk about these problems in honest ways that actually expose some of the problems that are income and race-based.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much. I love that question. So, and you'll see this in one of our messages. We started off with a shared value about, and I can't remember if this was either Minnesota Strong or Vibrant Communities. Start off with the shared value, right? That we can't afford the rent, no matter who we are. We can't, you know, I'm sorry, excuse me. It started with the shared value about housing and how it was so important for us to thrive and succeed. I think it was a Vibrant message, but how important it was for us to be able to afford a place that when we could afford a place to live, we could thrive. But not all of us can do that because rent is too expensive. And so what I would suggest, Michael, because this is so key, is reminding your policymakers, your powers that be, the folks that are making the decision. We all need this. All of us want a stronger Minnesota. And for us to have a stronger Minnesota, it means all of us, no matter who we are, have to be able to live in homes we can afford, in safe homes, starting with that shared value. But guess what, XYZ legislator, all of us don't get to do that because of the myriad of reasons that we have talked about, or programs that don't actually help them. They help these folks, which is great, but they don't help these folks. So when we think about that shared value that we all want, which is to have a stronger Minnesota, it actually means all of us need to engage in that. And so the piece that I'm suggesting, Michael, is that whether they are elected leaders or they're policymakers, when we start, no matter who we are as humans, when we start with the negative or start with the problem, it doesn't resonate as deeply for folks as when we start off with, like, we want this thing, right? Like, we're all in this because this is the thing we want together. Here is the problem with it, and here's how we can get to it. So think of it maybe in 3 steps. Like, what is the thing we all want and why? What is the problem to get there, which are the problems that you named? And then here are the solutions. Grover, Sarah, Claire, anything else you'd add to that that could be helpful to Michael? Because this is a pretty common challenge, right? That so many of us have.
Yeah, I would just say, Michael, it sounds like in this case, you're thinking of the elected officials and the policymakers are your audience, right? And they will necessarily need a little more what we call wonk, right? The details of what you're talking about. And Marisol just modeled it of talking about a shared value and then what the problem is. And then the wonk goes into the problem and the solution. But it sounds like, and this happens a lot, right? You're saying we need more Black home ownership, but we're not allowed to put that on our applications. And then suddenly, right, turns out that mostly white people benefited from this program, right? And or similar with income. And so when you're going back, being really specific, so shared value, really specific about the problem. And then my guess is as you start to talk about solutions is when it starts to creep and creep and creep, like, oh yeah, poor people can't afford that, but we want firefighters to afford it. Like, yeah, firefighters are really important. But what we're seeing is that 90% of people who are low income can't afford a home. And if we want to have a stronger Minnesota, if we want a strong community, we have to address this problem. So really framing it as like, we need leadership, we need really effective solutions, like really getting into these strength frames and also reminding the depth of what needs to be solved and trying to keep it focused on that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And I was actually thinking, Michael, with your question, Ruth's mention of the income portion of like wanting 3 times, you know, the rent. That's a great example of like, we need everybody to be able to afford. For a thriving Minnesota, we need everybody to be able to afford it. Right now, people need to have first, last, and security. That's 3 times their income. That doesn't work. We need to shift that in order for everybody to be, in order for Minnesota to thrive. So it's like value, problem, value, solution. So thank you. That was good timing, Ruth, with your example. Let me go to
Sarah, Janicia also wanted to add, it sounds like she wanted to tag something on to Michael's question. So I don't know if you
Great.
wanted to add
Yeah,
that
Thank you.
before.
thank you. Thank you. Only if there was time. So thank you for letting there be a little bit of time. But I was just gonna say that, like, thank you all for answering in a way that like offers some structure and ways to put it together. And then I'll just say from experience navigating like kind of institutional powers and trying to get them to kind of like come online with thinking about actually being effective, the appeal to shared values, I think is very useful, because I think what I have experienced, again, both as a professional and then also as a community member who is experiencing different things or sharing background with folks that we're hoping to, create, better outcomes for. Um, we live in an environment where folks would definitely consider themselves to be more on the progressive side, more on the do-gooder side, like even folks who may share or have, or who may have maybe more conservative leaning values because of many different cultural things, from religion or um, other background things, right? Like folks would consider themselves doers, they consider themselves good folks. And I think that that appeal to shared values can be really effective in both calling out and calling in folks to say, hey, this is what we believe in. We've said that. We've said we believe in this. Let's go back and reframe, rework, redo. And so I've seen that be effective with like persuadables that also have institutional power. And I've seen that also be effective for folks who have institutional power and would consider themselves part of like that base that already agrees with us, to be able to sort of empower in conversations with those folks who are persuadables. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it resonated with me. And so I wanted to just add that.
Yeah, thank you, Janice. I really appreciate that.
I want to make sure we get to Jenny's question. And Jenny actually just made a great point in the chat that, the research can also be used to show how many people want, and are concerned about, think housing is a problem, want real solutions. So I think that's a great point, Jenny. And you had also earlier asked a question, wondering about who should be the villain, right? In the race class narrative, there's this suggestion that there needs to be a villain, but if Minnesotans are more persuaded that the villain is a system. So how do we deal with a system that's a villain, as opposed to, for example, calling out a vacation home, folks being the causes? How do we talk about villains as systems?
Yeah, Jenny, that's such a good question, because we work, all of us, in a wide variety of coalitions, right? And so we've worked in communities where, frankly, the villain was elected leaders. And we've worked in communities where, and I mean, we as in the Housing Narrative Lab, I'm not talking about Minnesota specifically, but just generally, where elected leaders have been the villains because they kind of have not been behaving as well as they could. In other cases, it actually has been corporate landlords. And so those are some places where some of this, right, where some of this happens, or excuse me, those are some places where some of the villains have, where we've named some villains. The challenge becomes, when you talk about the rents are high, you actually have to have a reason why rents are high. And in some cases, it may be a corporate landlord. It may be a corporate organization that is just jacking up rents. In some cases, it may be that, we don't have protections for tenants that can help stabilize rents. So I think that depending on your community, so the kind of that was a slightly longer answer. Really, the answer is there's no one size fits all villain. And so it's really going to depend on what community you're working in, and the work that you are trying to engage in, and the goal. Because if you're working, and I'll just give an example around tenant protections, your villain may be a very different institution than if you were trying to pass a measure that would allow for more funding, right? Those villains may not be the same. So I think that to some extent, you will need to be looking at, or even, again, depending on your coalition, just to be real, your villain may have to be a more systemic villain, right? Like, we need more livable wages. Employers need to pay more. That's a villain right there, right? And so
Yeah,
I think that's going to really vary on your goal and your audience.
But just to confirm too, I thought I saw in the data that it wasn't persuasive to Minnesotans to name developers as the villain. Okay.
Well, let me back up. So it wasn't persuasive to name. What we tested actually was around homeowners, second homeowners, investors, developers. They just like felt, or even elected leaders, right? Folks just felt it was kind of polarizing. So that leaves you with having to talk more about how this is an opportunity for the people that could have a say and maybe aren't doing the thing you need them to have more of a say in. It is an opportunity for them to work together to pass these solutions, because Minnesotans actually, the framing they want to hear is not one of blaming, but the framing that they want is actually one of like, how are you and I going to work together to get this thing done? And again, Grover, Claire, Sarah, if there's anything around that question that we could offer that maybe I missed, please jump in. Oh, actually, sorry, Scarlett mentioned zoning and land use. We saw some in the research, zoning and land use, so folks just sort of like zoned out. So the minute you use zoning land use, it's just not use that language. Folks just didn't, that didn't resonate with Minnesotans as much.
Marisol, that's one thing that when Jenny was saying who the villain is, that's what one thing that we see a lot of in development. We develop housing. That's what we do. We build affordable housing. So when we look at it, one of our biggest nemesises, MSI, however you want to phrase that, is zoning. Zoning doesn't allow for the appropriate density. It doesn't allow for multifamily. You can't have ADUs. You can't have, triplexes or quadruplexes because the zoning has not been updated for decades. And then you look at rental ordinances, there's nobody monitoring it. So that you have these landlords that are really capitalizing on however many dimes and dollars a person can save together for subpar housing. So that is what we combat when we talk to cities and communities that say they have a screaming need for housing. That is what development lives and dies with, is zoning. To the average person, do they know what it means? No, but that's, if we want to build housing that is, for all people, we need that zoning, whether they understand it or not. And then it goes back to, that's an actionable item. That's an empowerment item. If you don't know what it is, you are empowered to figure out what it means, how to get involved, and how to change it if you want housing.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Scarlett, and all of it. And the thing that I would add to that is that when you're talking to people about zoning, because that's just a fact, right? Zoning is getting in the way of you being able to build affordable housing that all of us can, or housing that all of us can afford. So coming back to, we need a stronger Minnesota, and a stronger Minnesota happens when we all have housing we can afford, no matter who we are, the kind of job we have, no matter what part of the community we live in. We all need housing we can afford. And in some of our communities, we've got regulations that have been decades and centuries in our books that get in the way, or that are so old, they don't account for the realities of what our people, what our communities, what our Minnesotans are facing today. And that's what we need to change. So I'm saying the same thing you just said, right? I know I don't actually use the word zoning because that it trips people up. So we just need to get them open enough to hear us, so that eventually we're going to get to the zoning conversation. I'm not saying we're not, But if we kick off the conversation with zoning, we need to change zoning laws, like all the doors, all the windows, curtains closed, lights off on the porch, the whole shebang. If we start out with the shared value and then get into some of these pieces that are hard, because the minute you mention change, people are just gonna they're gonna back away very quickly. So this is about not changing the goals and your solutions. This is about shifting how you talk about them based on the varying audiences that you're gonna bring in, because people are just gonna hear it slightly differently. And I hear you, Ms. Jackson, quality. Quality is really important. So quality and affordability, because in Minnesota, what resonated with people was that affordability frame. But when you combine quality and affordability together, you say quality and affordability, people will hear you more. And Grover, looked like you also wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I was starting to put it in the chat, but for something like Marisol's saying, zoning is so central to so much, and also people zone out, zone out, zone out, zone out. It's really, really hard to get somebody in deep enough to resonate with zoning. And so things like rules that stop us from using the space we have to create homes for families that need them. Rules that will allow us to use the space that we have in this city to create homes for 20 families, not just one. Like using more descriptive terms to talk about zoning that help people understand the rules without ever having, right? To what extent do you need people to repeat the word zoning back to you versus to support the solutions when you're like, that's why you should vote yes, right? Like something very specific that you're asking them to do with your call to action.
Yeah, I hear that, Evan. We do this with housing all the time, don't we? We use our internal language. I think if there's one thing that maybe I would say I'd love for you all to walk away with from this research, because again, it is so heady and there's a lot. Minnesotans as a whole, including our base, they don't think like us. We're so steeped and rooted in the work that we are doing in housing that again, this is connecting the dots. We may talk about zoning. People may kind of tune out, or they might think of zoning as like, this is what makes our community our community. They may have that as a perception. So the minute you start talking about shifting zoning laws, they might like, ooh, no, we don't want to change anything about the way our community works, versus explaining, to Grover's point, why having different kinds of housing that all of us can afford would make Minnesota stronger. And those are the dots and the ways and the pieces that the research is pointing to. The Minnesotans don't think the way we do on this call, because we are advocates. We're not the base, and we're not obviously not persuadables, right?
Michael asked a question about wondering if starting with a shared value and then sort of asking the audience what they think stands in the way. And I think that can be a really great engagement tool. However, we want to frame the problems in ways that are going to be helpful to our work. We might not want to put in just an open-ended, because we want to sort of frame it like, what do you think of these 3 or 4 things? Housing affordability, land use, things like that. Because if it's opened up so completely, we might get people off track. And we want to, in the framing conversation that Marisol talked about, like, we want to be sharing conversation with a lens, language that helps people see the solutions that we're going to connect to. So Michael, I think it's a great way for engagement, but we might want to put some parameters around the choices that we're offering so that we can suggest a solution that is aligned with our work. Does that make sense?
I would add
Very
to
much so.
Michael, Oh, I was just going to add that when we conducted both the listening tour, which was the focus groups of the field, the housing fields in Minnesota, when we conducted the focus groups and then the focus groups among Minnesotans, and then the online survey, there were a lot of questions about the shared value. And then we did also ask folks what they thought were the causes, so that the research showed you'll see from the research around like what people are thinking are the reasons. And in Minnesota, they connect these economic factors very, very strongly as a way to start moving people to understand the various parts that you're talking about, Michael. It is a strong, what you're talking about, depending on your audience, it can be a strong engagement piece, but also know that from the research, we actually, that was a research question. And so that the results that you are hearing are from those exact research questions.
Wendy asked a great question, which I think is fascinating. How, like, what did we learn about Minnesota that differs from other states? In what ways is Minnesota particularly unique?
Yes, thank you so much. I love this question. So you are unique and similar in some ways. Similar in that when you explicitly connect the dots around housing affordability and the consequences of not being able to afford housing and what happens to our families when they can't afford a place to live because rents are increasingly high, that is a commonality that we see across the board, both nationally and also locally. Where Minnesota has been, where Minnesota is unique. Oh, and also around the idea of community and what community looks like, right? We as people who live in this country very much do think on the surface about our local communities. So to the point about housing is local, it really is, right? Because it is all about the communities that we are trying to build. So there's some commonalities there. And you also want to see yourself in both the issue and the solution, which is really, really important. Some of the differences, and one of the primary differences, I think, is that Minnesotans see a broad range of solutions. You see the complexity of housing, right? Minnesotans as a whole see the complexities, and you will see that there are different potential solutions that can come in. And that is a really strong value that you all are bringing, is that broad range of how how the folks in your state think about the varying solutions. And that's really helpful for you all because you're working at this from many different places, both together as coalitions and individually as organizations or individually as people. You're coming in it from a lot of different kinds of solutions. And so the fact that you have a state of residents who understand and see that you can have a lot of variety in your solutions is actually really important.
I think Libby raised a great question about repetition. So you're going to hear everyone everywhere all the time. I promise you in the response. The question is, I'm curious how much of all of us should be repeating verbatim the same phrases versus tailoring. And this is such a great question, Libby. And I know Marisol has an
Go
answer.
ahead, Sarah, jump in. Do it.
So we have to repeat, we have to flood the zone. We know this, but we need it to be part of our dinner conversations at church, at the hair salon, when we're meeting our cousins for picnics, and when we're speaking to elected leaders and community leaders, right? It's really, really important. Narrative doesn't happen, with one or two mentions. It has to be part of our continuous cultural conversation. So that's like, you're seeing it in the newspaper and on the news, and when you're in conversation with people, and on social media, and you saw it in LinkedIn. But what's really important to note is that it doesn't have to be verbatim, right? What we're offering here is a roadmap, as Marisol showed you, the roadmap to get to that North Star narrative. And there are words and phrases that definitely resonate well. The words to replace and embrace, those are important to keep in mind. But as Ms. Jackson mentioned, wanting to add quality, right? We would never say, don't say quality, because we didn't test that. It's affordability and quality. So you need to make it your own, and you need to make it your own based on who you're talking to and your comfort level, your focus areas. So these are guides for you to repeat in all the places, but to make it your own. Marisol, did that cover it?
Scale, consistency, and repetition, everyone, everywhere, all the time. So the only way we make narrative change is scale, all of us together, everyone, everywhere, right? So yeah, that's it. I think we have 5 more minutes. Any other last minute questions? And then, because Jenny, I didn't know if you wanted to also close us out, letting folks know about where they can reach some of the pieces, etc. So maybe if there is any other questions, Sarah?
No, I think it's great. I definitely noticed Linda mentioned 5th, 6th grade reading literacy levels. And I think, you know, speaking to the zoning conversations and the policymaker conversations, we use language and acronyms that don't always connect or often don't connect with people. And we need to be really mindful to use action-oriented language, values-based language, and simple language, right? If we have a sentence that has 15 words, we bet we can make that sentence 7 words, and the 7 words is what we should use. So really appreciate you raising that up. And I will turn it over to Jenny to close us out.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. This was really exciting. We are, as I mentioned before, we are slowly uploading everything. There's tons of tools here. And we will be following up with everyone who's taken one of the webinars or who's even just registered for one of the webinars with links to everything. So there'll be a Google Drive with all those GIFs, and
Well, so I can jump in just really quickly because there's actually quite a bit. So the first is the message guide, which is a lot, but we also will have kind of a little quick hit fact sheet, cheat sheet that can help you to someone's question about, do you have this, short and condensed? But you will have the decks for all of our webinars. I believe Jenny has been sending everyone the recordings as well. You'll have the message guide, which also will have sample content. All the content you saw, you will have in sample form that you can make your own, you can use, however you all need to kind of work through it. And there's also a fields guide. And the fields guide is really kind of like a how-to for those of you that are like, I know Instagram, I know TikTok. This is like the how-to, or the how-to of reaching the media, all that good stuff. And then Jenny, you will have it all in a Google folder for folks, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Super. Well, I just want to say thank you all so very much. It's just been our absolute delight and our absolute pleasure to work with all of you as you all are thinking about and working on how you are shifting and moving housing narrative. So Jenny, thank you. And everyone, thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll all be in touch. The work is just starting.
Yep.